Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. So hopefully you can hear me and see me okay. This is a kind of an experiment to try to bring the whole picture-in-picture idea back, but because I wanted to really use it for this video. So this is a discussion kind of on the card collector versus card investor kind of thing that has been discussed a fair bit lately. One aspect of it that I really wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about and think about is that I'm not going to take the exact same angle as everybody else. Some of the questions that are being asked or thrown out there are kind of obvious to me. And also the timing's pretty good, given that just yesterday there was an all-time record for a modern sports card. A LeBron James card sold for 1.8 million. And kind of what does that mean? What does that mean going forward? What does that mean right now? And it's a fair question because at the end of the day, really a lot of us don't know. If you want to be super optimistic, you can say, oh, well, that's just the beginning. It continues forward. We're going to the moon. Someday it'll be a $10 million card, a $20 million card, a 50 million. Maybe. Now, if you want to be a little more pessimistic, you could say, well, that's kind of harbinger of the beginning of the end. It's kind of what happened with Project 2020 when the print runs kept rising and rising and rising. In this case, the LeBron James card, the print run isn't going to rise, and it's kind of an iconic card in his card library, if you will. And that's understandable, and I think that's a reasonable point to take. And for me, though, I'm looking at it as the perspective of kind of a collector from a long time. Quickly, just in case you've never seen my channel or have no idea who I am, I'm Carlos, and this is my channel. And when it comes to sports card collecting, even though this channel has only been doing that for a little over a year, I think at the end of 2018 is when I started focusing on sports card related videos. I've been a passionate collector for a long time. I've been collecting without any real interruption since 1990, because even in the time when things slowed down, I would still pick up a card here or there. I never actually stopped collecting, even through all the different times in my life leading up to that point. But that means that I've been collecting for 30 years. Now, does that mean I know everything? Not even close. There are plenty of people who have been in the game for less time than know them more than I do. And there's plenty of people that I know that have been in the game longer. But at the same time, 30 years does give you a little bit of an opportunity to have a little bit of perspective. And one of the things that has been interesting and also kind of disappointing for me is that there are some other collectors that I've seen videos of that I respect and that I enjoy watching their stuff because I consume tons of hobby content. But one of the things that I've heard a fair bit of is that they're still acting almost like the current climate is new. And in some respects it is. The whole pandemic thing definitely throws a wrench in it. There being no sports, there being no real gambling, there being no fantasy sports. All of these factors play into the way the market is working right now. You can't deny it. That is a new thing. But the concept of people kind of running in gold rush style to get in on the hot thing where sports cards, as those prices go up, people see dollar signs and they run towards the gold rush. Because if you know anything about your history, the gold rush isn't because people really like digging in the dirt for shiny metal. People saw dollar signs, people saw opportunity. And where people see opportunity, there's going to be people that are going to want to take advantage of it, and there are going to be people that want to get in their share. But before I get into a little bit of that, I'm not going to focus on the gold rush and that part of it too much, but I do want to give you a little bit of history, and I'm going to give you context with maybe a different hobby that you haven't considered. So that's why I say it's going to be a little different angle than a lot of people are taking. But first, let's cover the main question being asked right off the top. Can you be a collector and an investor? The answer is yes. Honestly, it is. Now, you can move the slider back and forth. You can be more of a collector and more of an investor, or a full-fledged investor or a full-fledged collector. I kind of put myself kind of in the middle in the sense that I flipped cards in the past, and I've also bought cards with the idea that if they work out, I'm more than willing to move on with them. And there's other cards in my collection that I have no intention of moving anywhere. But I'm a realist. Not everybody feels the same way that I do, but I can tell you in a complete honesty that I'm the kind of collector where, while I have spent a lot of time collecting some of my stuff, and bear with me, I'm just playing around with one of the other screens, but while I've been collecting a long time and I've worked on certain collections, because if you have seen this channel a lot, you see that one of the main things I do in my pickup videos is I talk about my Mike Modano collection. And part of the reason for that is necessity, because I'm in Canada and right now mail across the border isn't that great. So a lot of my vintage baseball stuff that I like to pick up as well, a lot of the supply is down there. Well, the problem is it takes forever to get up here. So I've been kind of focusing on the Modano collection exclusively for a while. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to go back and work on those sets later on. But for the current moment, I'm focusing on that collection. And that collection has been ongoing since 1995. So from a long-term perspective is I've been collecting for 30 years. I've been collecting one player for 25 years. My eBay account is 22 years old. So it's one of those things where I kind of look at the perspective of a lot of these new hobby channels that have been coming up, especially ones focused on the investing side of it. And it's been kind of funny for me because I'll see some of them, and it's not everybody, but some of them are like in their late teens and early 20s. And I kind of have to chuckle to myself. It's like, my eBay account's older than you are. My eBay account last year could drink legally. That's how long I've been in that part of it. And if any of you know eBay from back then, that was the money order time. There was no PayPal back then. You were having to, if you wanted to get your stuff, you had to go and send a money order, wait for it to arrive, wait for the dealer to get it, or the seller, wait for the seller to get it, and then ship it back to you and hope that it eventually shows up. And it's one of those things that we needed a lot of more patience back then. It's not instantaneous pay in PayPal. Hey, you haven't shipped it in 2 days. What the heck? It was a very different era. And, I'm not going to lie, I kind of prefer the current era. It's a little bit easier and more straightforward. You get your payment, you make your payment, you move on. But as far as the investing collecting thing, let's get back into that for a moment. Like I said, there's a slider that you can, if you really think about it, you can fall on kind of either side of the fence. But the real question isn't whether you can be one or the other or both, because like I said, yes, you can. I don't think there should be a lot of debate on that, but whether there is or not is kind of your own feeling on the matter. But where I think you've got some room to really debate and discuss a lot is really, is it a good thing or a bad thing? And the answer is, it's not a new thing. I don't think it's a good or a bad thing, really. It kind of depends on your perspective. That's why I gave my background at the beginning, because, looking at it as a general collector, the price of some of the stuff that I've been interested in has gone up. But looking at it from the Medano collector side of it, focusing in on that specific collection, I'll be honest with you, in the last calendar year, I've probably gotten my hands on more grails and more cards that I've wanted for like 10, 15, 20 years than I did in the previous 24 years of collecting my player. And a lot of that is because of availability. And honestly, the only issue that I had was availability. But funny enough, by the time it became available, I'm very comfortable and very confident, even though I've paid what I felt were strong prices and I offered what I felt were strong prices for the cards. I'm very confident that if I had tried to buy it 15 or 20 years ago, it would have cost me a lot more than it cost me today. I think the distance in time, and I look, for example, the example that I would use would be like the 97, 98 Pinnacle certified, the mirror gold, or the totally certified, platinum gold and stuff like that. Those were super tough cards back in the day. They would have cost me a bundle, and they still cost me some decent money today, or, in the last year when I picked them up. But at the same time, it really didn't feel like it was that much of a stretch for me to go get it. Now, part of that is because I'm further along in my career. I have more disposable income to be doing that. Those are all factors. That's all part of it. But in all honesty, it cost me less than it would have cost me back then. So my prices haven't gone up. So I think an important thing to remember is that the whole hobby hasn't gone up. Certain segments of the hobby have gone up. Certain cards in certain segments of the hobby have definitely gone up. And I think what's thrown a lot of people off is that not only rookies have gone up, not only some limited cards of certain players have gone up, but you've got base cards of some players have gone up. And I think that's been the surprising piece that has really thrown people off. So the general piece, so number one, collecting versus investing, I think you can be either or both. It's really up to kind of you and what your goals are and what you want to do. But the second thing is whether it's a good or bad thing. It really depends on your perspective. I honestly don't think it's either good or bad. And I think the situation is going to cycle itself out, because again, and kind of what I mentioned in my little first part of my dialogue here, it's not new. It's not new in the hobby, and it's not new in hobbies in general. And I'll give you kind of some food for thought, because really when we're talking about, investing and, a bubble growing and eventually popping, we're thinking to the junk wax era. But something important that you want to bear in mind that I think differs the current era from that era is, number one, we do not have the quantity we have right now, but we also don't have the amount of quote unquote collectors and investors that we did back then. And I think that's where some people are kind of having almost a nostalgia, because they're thinking back then that if they were collecting back at that time, and they were misremembering what actually was going on. The truth is, there were a lot of people who were throwing money at the hobby at that time because they all thought they were going to get rich. And the way to think of it is, because we didn't have social media back then, the internet wasn't a thing back then. So we're thinking the late 80s and early 90s. So think about that era. Well, people didn't realize that the oversupply thing was happening. And the reason that is because people were buying, bricks of, like, say, 100 1988 Donruss Greg Jeffries or 1991 Todd Van Poppel. Well, no one who on earth would want or need 100 Todd Van Poppel rookie cards, unless your intention is to potentially sell it down the road and make a bunch of money. That's the only reason you would do it. That's the only reason dealers would sell it to you. So the idea of trying to get rich quick in the long run, or even in the long run, even if you thought it was a long-term play, The idea of buying these sports cards and then turning around for more value and becoming wealthy, that's not new. That was 30 years ago. That was when I started collecting. It was already well entrenched, and it was on its way to ending. But an important thing that kind of needs to be considered, because people freak out about stuff like that. And even if a bubble did pop, remember something important. 1990, 91, the cards are being released. The overproduction era is still well in effect. 92, the overproduction era is still well in effect. 93, 94, at some point there, we deem it that the bubble kind of popped and a lot of that started to go away. But taking Topps flagship as an example in baseball, you have a 93 set, you have a 94 set. The 95 set is small because of the strike shortened year, because 94, obviously we didn't have a World Series, and 95 was a shortened season because it started a little late. But the 95 set existed. And so did the 96. That was the Mickey Mantle tribute year where you had a lot of those cards. 97, 98. 98, I remember opening a bunch of boxes for. 99, 2000. You notice it never stopped. The bubble, quote unquote, popped. The junk wax era ended. People were burned and turned away from the hobby. And yet it rolls on. The beat goes on either way. It's funny how that works. The hobby is a lot more resilient, I think, than people think. I think you really fall in the camp of whether you're a pessimist or an optimist, and that's really a factor in how you respond to it. I really think this is an opportunity for some folks where, take your profit. If you already have some inventory and you want to sell it, take your profit. If you're a collector and you're really worried about these prices, though, I would point out to you something. In reality, if you think that the investors are the only ones that are driving up this price, that's fair. And I think that's a reasonable argument can be made. But I should point out to you something. You are feeding the beast, because the reality is, not all of you, because some of you are refraining because of the cost that I'm talking about. But a lot of you are complaining about it, but then at the same time still buying product. Well, here's the thing. If you stop buying blasters, if you stop buying boxes, if you stop buying singles, if you focus on other areas that haven't gone up in price, or just chill. Basically, if all the real quote unquote collectors chilled out for 90 days and just enjoyed their collections they already had, and suddenly all these investors kept trying to sell things and found that they were only able to sell to investors, who in turn would try to sell to other investors, and the liquidity in the market suddenly dried up. What you would find is these prices would plummet pretty quickly. But the thing is, I don't think you're going to do that. Collectors don't exactly have the greatest willpower to be able to hold back. I think collectors want to collect, and that's kind of where they kind of punish themselves for their own necessity in terms of staying in there. And like I said, there's some of us who have been collecting stuff where we're not really getting hurt price-wise. And here's the thing. If the Medano cards became too expensive for me, I would hold back and I'd chill out. I've literally got 1,400 Medano cards, different ones. I can enjoy my collection. I can have fun taking pictures, putting stuff on Instagram, chatting with people, enjoying the hobby from that perspective. I can enjoy the hobby as an observer for a while. I'm okay with that. I have the luxury. I feel comfortable being able to do something like that. Not everybody can, and I understand that. That's fair. But like I said, I think perspective helps, because like I said, this isn't new. This didn't get invented recently. Even the concept of trying to make money and being an investor isn't new, because the moment that someone sold a card that maybe they picked up somewhere cheap for a profit, well, the investing in business part of the hobby came in. When did that start? Well, it depends on you. It depends on when you want to think about it. I can give you a couple of dates if you want to decide for yourself. 1984 is when Beckett came out. They weren't the first price guide, but they became the mainstream. They became the standard in that portion of the hobby. How about 1980? That's when the first national happened. Okay, you don't like that? How about the mid-1970s? Kit Young. So when I was a younger collector, my first Beckett book that I ever got was the 1993 edition. It was this small, like square-like book. It was pretty, it was maybe about this size, not very big. And when I had it, one of the things they had, in addition to all the prices and all the listings of everything, they also had these little ads in the back for different dealers that were that basically were paid to be in part of the Beckett magazine, as well as the annual price guide. And one of the ones that I remember from back then was Kit Young. And Kit Young was a famous one, still around. It still exists. And they would have the Kit Young catalog. And I remember ordering the Kit Young catalog once and kind of flipping through it and checking out all the stuff that Kit Young had, because they had a lot of vintage. Because even back then I was interested in vintage. It was an aspirational thing. I wanted to have 50s Mickey Mantles and Willie Mays cards and all that. That was always interesting to me. And I always loved that. So Kit Young had all these, displays. And I think they had the 52 Mantle in the ad, if memory serves me, something like that. And a good card to put in there. But the reason I bring all this up is that Kit Young started in 1976, get thereabouts. I might be a year or two off on some of these numbers, so bear with me. But It was a long time ago. It isn't new. That was a full-time dealer in 1976. The National started in 1980. Beckett magazine started, either the book or the magazine. I think it was the book first and then the magazine after. But either way, 1984. Well, I'm born in 1983. So my entire lifetime, effectively, that's been there. And then I can go further back if I pick one of those other dates. This isn't new. And every time, I promise you, no matter what happens with the current cycle, the next time there's money to be made, the people will rush right back in, and the current collectors of time will complain that it's ruining the hobby because it always ruins the hobby. Well, the hobby is what you make of it. And I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to just, shoo away your complaints. They're fair. I understand them. But again, this isn't new. Now, I talked a little bit about the junk wax era, but I want to give you an example here. This isn't apples to apples, but I thought it was interesting. I was doing a little bit of reading the other day, and it kind of inspired me, in addition to the LeBron James thing, because the timing was perfect. But a thing that inspired me is I wanted to talk about another hobby that I've dabbled in the past that I think gives an interesting perspective on what happens. Because one of the things, like I said, fantasy sports money is not going into fantasy sports. That's a potential for more money going into the hobby. That might be a factor. The fact that gambling isn't available, that might be a factor bringing more money into the hobby as people try to find some outlet to do that. Those are all valid things, probably. But let me throw something else at you. This is kind of the other thing is the possibility that there's some institutional money that is coming out and entering into the fray. And if that's true, fair enough, that's going to make things really interesting. So from that perspective, we got to ask ourselves, what happens when institutional money comes in? The answer is it depends, but we do have a corollary in history. There is something we can draw from, and we can draw from another hobby that's been around longer. And I would point you, like I said, it's not apples to apples because this hobby is a lot more narrow these days, whereas the card hobby is a little bit more broad, I would say, because sports fans can appreciate it, art fans can appreciate it, design fans can appreciate it. There's different groups that can appreciate it. But let me talk for a second about numismatics, coin collecting. Okay. Why would I make this comparison? Because that hobby is older. It's been around longer. It's a more mature hobby. Again, it is more narrow. I understand that. But $1 million coins are a lot more common than $1 million sports cards. The LeBron James notwithstanding, that isn't a common occurrence. Will it become more of a common occurrence? Possibly. But part and parcel of that is going to be inflation. But I'm saying that these coins became expensive. 6-figure coins are pretty common. 7-figure coins are not like everyday occurrences, but they're pretty common. Even 8-figure coins have happened. So when we consider a hobby that's already been around longer and these kind of things have happened, and grading started for coins earlier than sports cards. PSA started in 1991. Well, coin grading started in the 1980s. And the 1980s is where the story will take place that really explains this. But before I get to that, and I'll get that in just a second, I want to give you that story. Before that, let me take it a little further back. I want to take it in 1948. Well, in 1948, Bowman came out with the first set that ushered in the modern era, the post-war era of sports cards. But something else happened in 1948 that relates to coin collecting that kind of fills in a little bit of the blank that'll take us into that story that I was talking about, the institutional investors and that kind of thing. See, it all ties together. So you have to stick with me on this one. So I want to share my screen with you a little bit here. Let me see if I can do this. That's part of the reason I'm playing around with this StreamYard here to try to do this. So let's give this a go. See if we can do that from here. Okay, cool. So I'm going to try this here. There we go. That's better. Okay, great. So I've got an article here from Coin World. Now, you'll have to bear with me. I'm looking to the side to my second monitor so I can read pieces of it to you. I'm not going to read you the whole article, I promise, but I want to give you a specific segment of this article so you can see it for yourself. And I thought it was very interesting. It happened to come up while I was doing some other reading. When I'm talking about the hobby and I'm talking about the concept of wherever there's money to be made, it influences different things in the hobby and what people do. Well, like I said, coin collecting is more mature. The whole concept of dealing and things like that have been around in coin collecting longer than in the sports card hobby, but there are lessons to be learned in the way that people responded, the way people did things, and how that impacted things. Now, one thing about coin collecting that is very different from the card hobby, even though they both have condition sensitivity, and obviously a higher condition collectible is worth more than a lower condition collectible. That's standard across all collectibles. Condition is important. Coins use a unique grading scale. They use a 1 to 70 grading scale. They don't use a 1 to 10. They don't use a 1 to 100. They use a 1 to 70. Now, if you don't know anything about coin collecting, you may be asking yourself, why? Why 1 to 70? That seems kind of odd. Well, you'd be right. But there is a rationale for it. And this article talks a little bit about that. And I'll include a link in the description for this, if in case for some reason you got some time on your hands and want to read this a little bit. Now, the article is talking about the brief history and, more importantly, the explanation about coin grading scale, why the 1 to 70 scale even came into being. Well, the answer is right here in the article, and hopefully you can read that. It seems all right on the screen, but we'll see. So here, in developing his system, Dr. Sheldon, so it's called the Sheldon scale, the 1 to 70 scale. So in his developing his system, Dr. Sheldon was attempting to find multipliers of a base value for each grade. With a coin in poor condition, so that's the lowest, so that's a 1, in poor condition assigned a base value of 1. Thus, a coin in fair condition was assigned a multiplying value of 2. So if you're doing coin grading, a fair is an F2, so following the scale, and therefore thought to be worth twice the value of a coin in poor condition. Similarly, Sheldon decided that a fine coin was worth 12 times the value of a poor example, and so on to a perfect mint state specimen. So that's a perfect, quote unquote, coin, perfect mint state specimen, which Sheldon decided was worth 70 times the value of the same coin in poor quality. So actually, the Sheldon numbers were not meant to define the quality of coins. They were not a grading scale originally, but rather to indicate the dollar value of various grades. This is in 1948. The thing that became the grading standard, the numerical standard that is used to grade coins today, and what third-party grading uses. So if you ever see a third-party grading slab for a coin, they use the scale from 1 for poor to 70, mint state 70, MS 70. That was originally related to doing relative value. A poor coin at 1 is 1/70th, or you could say a 70, a perfect coin, quote unquote, is worth 70 times what the poor was. It was built on relative value. That's in 1948. They were thinking about the value. And even that influenced what eventually became the grading scale. So think about that. It's kind of interesting the way that formulated and then how that evolved from there. So that's how you got the 170 scale. Now let's talk about coin grading itself and why this relates to this whole bubble discussion. Like I said, I'm taking you in a weird path here. Now there's this chart here that we're looking at, and I want to explain the context of this first, and then we'll go back to this chart and I'll explain. Okay, here's the short version. I'm not going to read you all of this again. I'm going to keep it kind of short. But what I want you to understand is that in the late 1980s, there was a stock market crash. That was 1987. So that was a kind of a famous crash here. And I want to go to the specific spot here for you. Okay, here we go. So in the late 1980s, there was a run where institutional money started going into the rare coin market. Why? Well, after the crash in 1987, so here, if you look at this, the 1987 stock market crash, widely known as Black Monday, famous thing in economics. On October 19th, 1987, the Dow Jones Industrial Average collapsed by 22.61%. So this was a seismic event at the time. It was a famous event. It's still referenced today when a big decline happens. But it was the largest one-day percentage loss in the index's history, even though the resulting bear market in stocks was over within a few months. So it didn't last that long, but it was a big impact for that short time period. Many disillusioned equity investors look for alternative investments. Alternative investments might be a familiar thing if you watch a lot of these investment videos. It's not a new phrase. Again, what is old is new again. That's why I have fun with these things. Knowing history is kind of useful sometimes. That's just me. Mind you, I studied history, so I'm kind of biased on this regard. But stay with me on this one. Numismatically valuable U.S. coins seem to offer a good substitute for the treacherous stock market. So when you don't like one thing, you move on to an alternative investment. In this case, the alternative investment is kind of because, well, gambling's not available. And in my conclusion, I'll talk about why I don't think it quite applies the same way here. And again, these are two different markets. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but I'm saying it's interesting, the comparisons and the corollaries to what has already happened in the past. This is more than 30 years ago. So this is not a new thing, like I said. Okay, real quick. The most important factor in the certified coin bubble was undoubtedly the development of slabbing itself. Again, certified grading happened in coins sooner than in baseball, football, and hockey cards and all that. This happened before. So these guys were ahead of the curve in terms of starting that process. But that combined with the stock market crash and people looking for alternative investments suddenly made it very interesting, because the whole thing with certified grading was, if you had these rare coins and these expensive coins, they were even expensive back then by the 1980 standards, you didn't want to pay top dollar for something that was sight unseen, because that was a very scary proposition. Number one, how accurate is your description on the grade? Number two, can I trust your grading? Number three, is it an authentic coin? All these things that we worry about today. You're not going to buy a 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle sight unseen. I don't care how high the resolution is. if you can't either A, handle it yourself, or B, have somebody that you can trust go look at it, maybe somebody that's handled a lot of 52 tops cards and can vouch for its authenticity. Of course, if it's already graded by somebody that's respected that you trust, well, that makes it a lot easier to do the transaction, and you might be willing to pay more for the coin or in this or the card. Well, that's kind of what happened. So it made the sensation that, oh, this must mean it's now safer. Well, now this market is more liquid. And now for these alternative investment people that are looking for this alternative investment, this seemed like a real possibility. So they started to look into this. So they talk a little bit about PCGS, which is owned by the same parent company as PSA. So there is a connection there, and NGC as well as a competitor. Okay, so real quick, I'm going to scroll past a lot of this. I want to skip to the end here. Okay, the situation is typical of all great bubbles. A legitimate innovation or discovery takes place that promises the future creation of tremendous wealth. Well, in this case, there's no innovation right now. We're in a pandemic. The money is being shifted around a little bit, but I want to get to the institutional money part. Okay, so let's move on here. In this case, the certified coin bubble is driven by the almost religious belief that slabbing would transform the numismatic market. Every time is the new. This is going to change the paradigm. This is a standard phrasing that always gets used. But it was widely thought that certified coins would enjoy improved liquidity. Important is liquidity. We got to have that. And of course, we got the grading today. That helps sales. A PSA 10 is going to be worth more than the ungraded card, even if they look like they're in the same condition, because you feel that extra little bit of safety with the certified card. Now, this here is important. So improved liquidity generated via massive institutional demand from financial firms. So this is big. Proponents at the time justified perpetually rising rare coin prices. So even at that time in the coin market, as the prices were going up and up and up and up, people came up with all the justifications. Well, obviously, now it's safer, so now we can spend more money on the market, and these institutional investors are coming in that are going to increase and raise prices, and that's what happened. So as the late 1980s unfolded, the enthusiasm reached a fever pitch, and it didn't take long for Wall Street to join the certified coin bubble. So this is a discussion that's actually been had a little bit lately about the possibility and what it would look like if an institutional investor firms started to do that. Well, in the coin market, this already happened in the 1980s. So what happened is here, in 1989, February, the respected firm of Kidler, Peabody & Co. created a limited partnership, the American Rare Coin Fund. So this is in 1989. A year later, Merrill Lynch launched a similar fund called the NFA World Coin Fund Limited Partnership. UBS, another Wall Street firm, created an internal rare coin division to advising high net worth clients on numismatics. It might sound ridiculous today, but that's what happened in the late 1980s. These Wall Street firms have been down this path before. Could they do the same thing for sports cards? Maybe, but that's what happened in the rare coin market. Now, what was the impact of that? Again, you notice I gave you all this in the late 1980s. Eventually, it crashed. Spoiler, eventually it crashed because they got disillusioned by it and prices started to slide, and they were unjustifiable by what was going on. It was kind of investors buying from investors, institutional investors buying from each other. It was really hard to justify. So in the end, it crashed. But before it did, a big thing happened. Now, let's go back to that chart at the beginning. This chart, what does it mean? This chart is referring to what's called the PCGS 3000. It's an index, not unlike the Dow Jones or the NASDAQ. Well, it's taking this list of rare coins, a list of them, and doing their compared price to create an index. So basically, the higher the number, the more these coins are worth. So the price is going up means that the index goes up, and vice versa. Okay, so this chart goes back to 1970. So it goes back quite a ways. So back in 1970, these coins weren't worth a ton, but in relative terms, they were probably fine. And then they started to peak around the early 1980s here. And by that point, they would have been worth over $40,000 for these coins in this index. Okay. And then they dipped down here by 1982. But then from 1982 onward, they started a rise. Now, remember, this whole thing with the certified grading and the whole thing with the institutional investors didn't happen until the late 1980s. So we're here in 1982, but you are seeing a steady rise. Now, this rise was more of an organic rise as people started to throw more money into it. Stop me if this sounds familiar. Anyway, so right around here, now when we get into this late 80s period, well, now is when the institutional investors are starting to look into it. Well, look what happens. All the way up here. This right here is somewhere between late 88, somewhere early 89. It kind of jives with the timetable of when those Wall Street funds started being created, and they started to throw money into the rare coin market. Funny how it reaches this high, and then almost equally Boom, 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 all the way. Now, it never drops all the way back down. The new floor has been established. It never drops all the way down. So this is by about 1994. So it takes years. It's not like it drops like a stone immediately, although this is a pretty dramatic fall here. So by around 1994, it's sitting at about 50,000, and then it bumps up a little bit around 2008, financial crisis time, funny enough, and when alternative investments are getting interesting again, question mark. And then, of course, down here, it's dipped down a little bit. It's right around, so this is around 2017. Okay, so the point that I'm trying to get at here is when the institutional money came in, it shot all the way up to over 181,000. It has never reclaimed this peak. Now, again, I mentioned the rare coin market is a lot flatter. It tends to skew a lot older because it tends to be folks that have already made their money elsewhere, and this is the hobby they've decided to take on, and they enjoy it. I like coin collecting. I think it's fun, but I don't put a lot of my energy into it because I don't make enough money to be able to have too many hobbies that I'm that passionate about. And sports cards and occasionally watches are things that I enjoy a little bit, and that's enough for me. Although I do occasionally dabble and buy a coin here or there because I love the history, that it still interests me. That's the reason why I was able to bring this up, because I still have an interest in and I still have a foot in this world, even if I don't actively participate in it. Plus, I thought it was a really interesting comparison. And at least it's an example of a hobby market when institutional money shows up. Again, do I expect this to be what's going to happen? Not necessarily. I don't think it's going to necessarily be the case, but I did think it was an interesting thing to bring up and an interesting thing to discuss. So I'm going to stop it with that because otherwise this history lesson could go on for a while. And also we could have this discussion. I consider this part one. I really am just discussing kind of some of my thoughts on it, my thoughts on potentially institutional money going into it. And the discussion about collector versus investor is something that if I'm going to talk about it more, I'm going to want to bring another voice into the conversation so that I can kind of play off them and maybe we can debate it a little bit more. That might be something that'd be interesting to maybe put on the channel, but I wanted to focus on this because I thought this historical corollary, let me get the angles right. So there we go. I thought this historical corollary was really interesting. And from my perspective, I think that's something that you want to remember history, even if you don't think it's necessarily applicable. Remember the saying, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. You want to understand it. And if you are a collector, I don't think you have anything to worry about. I think in the long run, this cycle is going to play itself out one way or the other, but the floor might go up. And history shows that even when something like this happens and does crash, the floor tends to go up over time. And that's something you do have to bear in mind as a collector. And was always a risk. It's one of those things you can't sit idly by and wait on maybe something you need forever, because even if it's not, the hobby growing necessarily, even if it's just inflation naturally growing, that's still going to be a factor. And it's something to bear in mind and remember. Stuff doesn't tend to be worth less as long as there is a market still out there. Do I think the market is as healthy as it looks given the price hikes that we're talking about? I don't know. I don't know if it's that sustainable, because if it is, then maybe we should all just be buying everything in sight because, well, then it's going to go up forever. I kind of doubt that. I leave it to you to decide for yourself where you think that goes. But before I go, I want to leave you with one or two things, just kind of some general principles that I'm operating under. And I'll talk about them more in my next video probably. But these are the things that I'm keeping in mind. Like I said, I'm not ignoring this market because I do understand there's an opportunity. I've been selling some cards lately and making a little bit of money on that. So it's done well for me. And I've been buying some with the idea that I'm going to hold on to them and sell. But one thing I'm going to lay out to you, well, actually two main things I'm going to talk to you about. No matter what you think about this market, whether you want to take a flyer or you don't want to take a flyer, but if you decide to dip your toes into these waters, bear in mind mitigating the risk. And what I mean when I say that is try to buy in for as little as possible. Don't just chase after what everybody else is chasing after. We do have analytic tools now, although, and this is again a subject for another video, I do think those analytic tools could make it very interesting to potentially be a cause as much as a prevention to market manipulation and some of that. I think they might cause as much market manipulation potentially as they prevent. But that's another video and another half hour or 45 minutes, and this one's already long enough. The second point that I want to make to you that's really important, I think, and I wish I had thrown it at the beginning of the video rather than at the end, is even if you're in the position where you feel like you need help, you need advice, you need guidance, here's my suggestion to you. Do not pay for it. Analytic tools and things like that might potentially help you, fine. I can see the argument for it. And I spend multiple videos talking about analytic tools recently. I talked about market movers. I talked about card ladder. But please, please, please do not give anyone money for advice, especially for financial advice, especially, well, unless it's real professional financial advice, not card financial advice. Do not pay for it. It is available for free. There are a lot of experienced collectors who can answer questions, or even if they don't know, they can direct you to someone. There are a lot of fantastic resources on YouTube. And probably in another video, I'll talk about a little bit about my little bit of investing philosophy, even though I only dabble my toes into it a little bit, just dabbling a little. There are some principles that I followed in general outside of the mitigating the risk. That is one of them that have served me well. And I think it's something that I'm probably going to talk about. But I think this video has been long enough. I appreciate it if you hung around this long. And hopefully this corollary is at least interesting to you. Even if you don't think it's applicable, it is still, I think, worthwhile considering and looking at what has already happened in other hobby markets and how these things might play out. If institutional money is really coming into the hobby, is this the future that we have to look forward to? I don't know if the hobby really has an index like this, but it'd be kind of interesting to see what it would look like if we look at it, 5, 10, or even 15 years from now. This is an interesting time, and I will be fascinated to see kind of where it goes. Anyway, so that's it for me on this video. Thanks very much for watching, checking it out. If you haven't already, I'd love if you'd leave a comment or question. I'd love to reply and kind of get a dialogue going. As well as that, if you haven't already, can you hit the like button? Subscribe, and I'm going to make other videos like this over time, although a lot of it will be focused on collector stuff. This is a topic that is interesting for right now, and I thought it was worthwhile discussing it a little bit in depth. Anyway, so hopefully this random departure didn't throw you off too much, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks very much.